So, the panel is going to talk about the rise of managed services and multi-vendor approach. And we'll start actually by each one of the panelists presenting himself, a few words about the company, with a focus on SD-WAN, because some of the companies are doing many, many things, and we want to focus it, of course, on SD-WAN. So we'll start with you, Eric.
Okay, my name's Eric Kreifelt. I'm a principal analyst with Telegeography. We're a market research firm that covers the global market for international network services, one of which is SD-WAN. And one of the ways we go about covering the SD-WAN market is that we actually have a partnership with the folks at Layer 123 on the WAN Summit, which is another event, and you have the placards there on your tables, and that audience informs a lot of our work from the end user perspective.
Hi everybody, my name's Sue White from Netcracker. So I head up the SDNFV strategy and marketing, and particularly in terms of Netcracker, we're not an SD-WAN vendor per se, but we provide a lot of the orchestration layer and the business layer on top that sort of allows you to scale and definitely go multi-vendor, that we'll talk more about. And also we put end-to-end solutions, so we work with a lot of the SD-WAN partners to create end-to-end solutions as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Cohn. I work with Spirent, the world leader in communications test. And I also hold a role on the MEF as the co-chair of the certification committee. So obviously test is near and dear to our heart. SD-WAN represents a significant opportunity in a very strategic way to pull together how testing is evolving to meet the needs of dynamic services. And the methodology that we've been thinking about for SD-WAN is going to span the entire life cycle, service life cycle, as well as traverse from the infrastructure layer all the way to the application layer and beyond.
Hi, I'm Carl Mörner. I'm the product manager for INEA NFV Access. INEA is a company working in embedded systems, in NFV, etc. And we are providing this product, which is a multi-vendor SD-WAN enabler, I would say. It's a virtualization platform for UCP deployments.
Okay, thank you. And as I said, my name is Amir Zmora, and I'm the CEO and founder of FlexiWAN, which is the world's first SD-WAN open source and an open architecture. And I would like to start kind of an introduction question, and after that I promise and I hope that we'll get questions from the audience, but I want to just set the stage with asking if you can define to me what do you view as, what is a multi-vendor approach, what's the reason for a service provider actually to have a multi-vendor approach? Is it just to have a second source? Is it because they can have more flexibility on the cost structure, on the feature structure? We'll start with you maybe, Carl, from the other side.
Okay, great. I think there are quite a few answers to that question. So I think one important aspect is the fact that nowadays with SD-WAN is more of an established technology these days, and the end customers know more about SD-WAN these days than in the past, and therefore they put new demands on the service providers. So demands like what vendors to use, what type of configurations to use, etc. And if the service provider can provide many SD-WAN brands and solutions to the customers to basically adapt to each market or adapt to each customer segment, they are much better off in terms of providing value.
So it's more on the functionality variety?
That's one aspect, yes.
Okay. Mark?
The customers that we're working with are managed service providers as well as traditional communication service providers. And the multi-vendor is becoming increasingly important. And if we think about the vision for NFV, it was always about choice. And end customers are choosing increasingly to address their individual environment and their needs with the individual products from a range of different vendors. And as a result, it's becoming increasingly important from the service provider's perspective is to be able to have a strategy to be able to integrate and somehow manage an increasingly complex and proliferated number of SD-WAN vendors that are actually accumulating within their overall networks. So it's choice.
So, I think, again, it's really two key things. I said on the first hand, for sure, some enterprises are comfortable with certain vendors and they'll maybe dictate they have a certain vendor in their solution. That's going to happen. But I think more so on the functionality. Without a doubt, if we think SD-WAN is just a base for many new services to come, and then we talk about those value-added services being, say, security and WAN acceleration. Well, that's just, the tip of the iceberg, hopefully, because the aim ultimately is to turn that edge into an edge of all sorts of applications. So I think the multi-vendor is certainly for SD-WAN features and functions to go from large enterprise and even take that to SMB. But for the value-added services like security and have a range, but also thinking even as we get to mobile edge cloud, the whole host of additional applications, whether it's IoT and other things that we can bundle in there. So I think that it's huge. The necessity to have that open or ability to open that up and have multiple vendors is going to be key.
Well, I suppose maybe as often the case, initially for the early adopters, the multi-vendor approach really wasn't an issue. I mean, because they wanted essentially to adopt SD-WAN so they wouldn't be beholden to MPLS VPNs and their service providers. And they would just pick a vendor and go with that. And there's different appetites for that. But by definition, the earliest adopters, that's all that was available at the time. So by definition, they're sort of single vendor operations. But subsequent to that, now that the service providers have gotten into the more managed, there have been managed offerings before, but again, from individual SD-WAN suppliers. Now that service providers have gotten into the game and are coming up with their offerings, now that other managed services are an option, now we would expect more adopters in the market to be proportionally more of that growing. And that's when I think the multi-vendor strategy becomes important. And maybe even within that, kind of a modular strategy so that a given service provider can kind of pick and choose a customized solution from different suppliers and have a compelling proposition to their market.
So although I want to take questions from the audience, but I must deep dive a bit more into what you said. So you talked about being able to pick and choose various things. What exactly do you mean? Do you mean to pick and choose, like Suzanne said, okay, so we have one enterprise customer who has these requirements and another one who has other requirements, so I can now decide which SD-WAN vendor I'm going to propose to each one of these enterprises? Or do you mean actually the elements of SD-WAN as the pick and choose that you mentioned?
I was referring to the elements of SD-WAN, and that's an attractive proposition, but it could also just be having a menu of a few different fully realized or fully packaged SD-WAN propositions to offer. But yes, also one that would have maybe one of the suppliers has a legacy of security, and they bring that best to the table because we can maybe get into that. Everyone has a different heritage, so that would be one example. Or another comes from WAN optimization, and for those aspects, things like that.
Great.
You would want to be able
I think that Carl will have something to say about this. Or to mention something about this because of the things that you're dealing with, with the VNFs and everything.
Yeah, exactly. So our approach is really to combine different building blocks to build SD-WAN solution and such. And the normal way we see it is that you separate security from the SD-WAN. Just because what you said, that security is definitely a different field, and the customers have very strong opinions about the security solution, and they want to combine that potentially with another vendor's SD-WAN. And it goes further than that also. In many cases, you want to have other VNFs and other brands to combine into a service chain or multiple service chains.
Okay, great. So before I bug you with more questions, let's see if we have questions from the audience. Anybody that has a question? Okay. So many questions, so I think that I have to continue to bug you. Actually, we're looking here at different approaches to multi-vendor, okay? We're looking at one approach, which is how do I answer the needs of various customers, and we heard one option is to provide just different vendors of SD-WAN. We heard another option that both Eric and Carl mentioned, the ability to actually mix and match various elements and VNFs or other elements in order to provide the solution. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges. Maybe Mark, if you can touch that a bit. What do you see as the main challenges for a service provider today to offer a multi-vendor solution?
Well, as we heard from just the first question, it's a fairly complex environment, and it's growing more complex than less complex, especially as we move into virtualization. So one of the challenges is to be able to manage that complexity through additional validation of how the actual SD-WAN elements are performing in this overall environment. Not just performing, but actually just operating. And there is going to be an additional need for providing more comprehensive testing and validation because of the need not only to manage the overlay, but to manage the overlay in respect to the underlays, which could also be very diverse among themselves. And then when we bring into the mix some additional capabilities, these additional VNFs, security was mentioned, but performance optimization is another. And there's other VNFs as well that are also going to be addressed. So we need to restore some order because we are not going to have a homogeneous environment, given that it's an inherent, very diverse environment in many large enterprises because of their organization.
Okay, so let's continue a bit with the challenges, and I'll just give an example of a service provider that I spoke with several times, and they're using 2 vendors today. So I asked them, how are you actually providing the service? Do you have some kind of a higher level orchestration, and does it tie into your systems? And they said, no. We have one, and we have the second one, and we provide them one by one, and that's it, okay? So it seems to me like there is a lot of complexity, okay? What things that you talked about, and maybe, Sue, if you can touch that, I'm sure that you will have a lot to say.
There's
Don't take all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So if you can touch a bit on that.
I think the key thing is that's it. When service providers bring the next vendor, you tend to build another silo. And if we think of what it takes in the first place for that initial silo, first of all, to order a service. So even though a lot of automation has been built in by the SD-WAN vendors for things like zero-touch provisioning, so you got automated configuration. If you take that up to the service layer, I want to connect this branch with SD-WAN to that branch, then you're at a level where you're starting to touch OSS. And today, that typically is manual. If it is automated, it's very proprietary. And the complexity of that integration is huge. And you ended up with lots of customizations, which certainly we'd be happy with in Netcracker to do those customizations. But clearly, that's not where the industry is going. So if you have that for one vendor, and if you think like the initial solutions that were sold were perhaps a few enterprise customers, hundreds of sites, and then suddenly your order intake goes up and up and up because you're starting to scale, in terms of the number of customers. You're going back to that manual provisioning. It's an absolute nightmare. Then you add in your other vendor, and not only you have to do it all again, they're completely different. They have different, APIs. They have different ways of describing the service, and that's one of the things that MEF was bringing in. So everything is completely different. So how you interface with OSS, how you interface with BSS, how you model the service, all those things are completely separate. You've got no unified way. You're coming in at 2 very, very technical portals, and then you might want a third vendor, and it's horrendous. So that's what we're finding is the issue, and that's absolutely what we've got to solve.
Okay, great. We'll continue in that in a minute. We have a question. But let's use the microphone. Excuse me for not stepping down.
So I have the following question. What we really mean with multi-vendor? Because, what you described is more you have options between different things. Multi-vendor would mean you mix. You have in one solution different technologies from a point of view that is technically impossible because all the technologies are proprietary. They use different protocols. They have different definitions. They are simply not interoperable. So you can do the higher level integration towards the BSS, OSS, I'm completely with you. But as a multi-vendor, you ask that question to the provider. My answer would be very simple. It is technically not possible. you can run different islands of a network with different controllers, but all the beauty of an SD-WAN, end-to-end visibility, central control, overall optimization of traffic flows are completely gone because you're managing more than one network. You're managing network islands. So that's just as a remark. So my question really is,
another question, yeah.
if you put up that headline, I would be interested to understand what you really mean if you talk about multi-vendor.
Okay, great question. Maybe turn off the microphone and we'll keep it there, so if there are other questions. Thank you. So somebody wants to touch this? I have some comments afterwards to say about this. It's a great question.
I'm happy to start. I think there's a few things. First, if we separate SD-WAN itself, I think SD-WAN and its, let's say, bundle of services, you're not going to split those features and functions up within one enterprise. Or if you do, it'll be different departments of an enterprise, so there'll be different groups managing that. But then when it comes to value-added services, that's different. So that's kind of needs to be managed. If you're doing true third-party managed services, that's coming through a network orchestrator. Okay, so you can start to manage these different entities. And as long as you've got something to bring it above that, which is a service orchestrator, you absolutely can automate across domains. You can set up a service that's SD-WAN that has security from, say, Palo Alto or Fortinet, and even automate going over your MPLS network, and you can bring those multi-domains together. It is feasible. But I do agree within today an SD-WAN solution, because it's proprietary between the controller and the CPE, you're not going to mix and match those features until maybe sometime in the future if that gets open. But today that's not the case. Okay, so it's a mix of multi-vendor.
But I think multi-vendor can also be about other things. For me, at least, multi-vendor can also be about white box hardware. So for instance, picking and choosing different hardware platforms for different purposes within a specific customer deployment. If some branch offices need some connectivity and others don't, you want to be able to adapt. And also here comes in the price aspect that you asked about before. Being able to pick and choose hardware vendors is a strategy for making sure that you pressure price on the overall solution, which I think is important. So for me, multi-vendor can be, I think it should be viewed as the entire stack of the SD-WAN, not just the SD-WAN VNF and its control itself, but also the entire solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I think multi-vendor, I mean, there's both sides of the equation to look at. Multi-vendor in terms of the end user, because that's one set of problems. But when we look at the managed service provider, there's also the just inherent need to be able to address the different customer needs. And there isn't one SD-WAN product that's going to be able to have that much functionality. And even if there was, there's going to be a number of other purchasing considerations that are going to lead us to any major operator having to support multiple different types of SD-WAN equipment. And as soon as that's the case, then we get into this idea of what level are we connecting them at. And in order to be able to address that, we're going to have some means of being able to assess and validate how these end-to-end services are actually provided, and whether they're just its connectivity or what level of functionality can be provided in a multi-vendor sense. Otherwise, as was pointed out earlier, it's going to be a series of islands that are going to be gatewayed together, for lack of a better term, that's going to require some high-level overlay to put things back together into a distinct service.
Okay, and Eric, something to add there?
Well, I mean, I don't want to stray too far from the spirit of the multi-vendor discussion, but part of the issue that the end users are facing is a multiplicity of vendor choices as it is. And there's 50 SD-WAN vendors out there. This is crazy. Who's going to survive and which one should I go with? I mean, these are major undertakings at multinational corporations with all kinds of risk and all kinds of stakeholders that they have to convince, and it's a big jump to do that. And and the state of play now is, again, they've made that jump, and it's been quite satisfactory just with the single vendor, more over the top type of solution. So whatever comes out of a multi-vendor environment through the service provider managed channel is going to have to be kind of quick and compelling, I think, to get that share of the market. And I think that share of the market is there, because it's different, not. I'm trying to use cliches like one size fits all. I mean, different types of enterprises will have different appetites for going more over the top or going more managed, getting into things like, having the underlay bundled in. That's very compelling. Or if you have the ability to manage a whole bunch of different suppliers at the underlay level, that's great. But if you don't have that capability, you're not going to want to go that direction.
Okay, so let's try to kind of summarize a bit and continue from there. So we spoke about the multi-vendor from perspective of launching various SD-WAN providers or vendors in order to answer various market needs. We spoke about what Eric mentioned about breaking the SD-WAN into various elements. You mentioned WAN optimization. I don't see it possible today with most of these solutions that you can actually break them. I know of one, but I'm not going to mention it because of the conflict of interest. So that's very hard. We do see this capability, for example, in the VNF orchestration. That it's closer to that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was mentioned also in the remark before the question was actually the ability to have a multi-vendor in the same network, let's call it, okay, and try to have interoperability. I think that in many, many panels we had in the past, and some of the people here were on those panels, everybody agrees to what you said as well. No chance that we will have edge software or edge device of vendor A talk with edge device of vendor B, and everybody will be happy. It will just not happen because everybody will not be happy because it means that they only have IPsec and not more than that. Okay, because everybody has their secret sauce inside it. So that's on that layer, and also on the controller, not so simple to have it. So at the end of the day, I think that we can all agree that SD-WAN is an end-to-end solution. And then we have the layer on top. And that's where I want to get to some standard options in order to really make life easier when you want to launch multiple vendors. And we have there the LSO APIs from the MEF, we have the Yang models from the IETF. If somebody can put some order into that, that'll be great, and maybe explain a little bit the value of these things. Who wants to try and take this?
I'll have a go.
Okay.
I'll have a start. So basically what we said before is we talked a lot about the complexity, and we've got to bring all that together somehow. And that's where this service orchestration layer comes in, because that is going to be key to unify having different vendor solutions in your offer, even though you may only pick one for this enterprise and a completely different one for that enterprise. I think we all agree with that. But you have to unify them. You can't have different integrations here and here and here. You can have one integration back to your OSS, BSS. And to do that, make that integration easier, certainly for vendors like us, it's good that everybody works towards a common set of APIs. So we can work with anybody's APIs, we can do all that proprietary, but if everybody, for example, between the orchestrator and the SD-WAN controller went towards something like MEF Presto, so that's work in progress right now, where we're doing a lot of work to contribute to that, and we'll talk about some of the proof of concepts we're doing in that area. But certainly that would be a great way to sort of minimize that integration. But even from the service orchestrator, and we should get to that top piece because we need to be able to visualize all these vendors in the same way. You don't want to go to a portal for vendor A, B, C, D, E. You want to have a unified portal where everything comes together. So you can configure everything, you can set your topology rules, you can monitor everything end to end, and you can use the APIs to deep dive to whatever level you want in those underlying systems. And that's Legato. So Legato, again, is quite reasonably well established now. Still some work to do. And then you've got your Yang models. And this, for me, is where automation really happens. Because in the past, it was very hard to bring automation beyond zero-touch provisioning. If you wanted to take it to the service level, you're into the proprietary domain. And I think with Yang models now, with the IETF, you now have a standard modeling language that everyone can use. So as long as the SD-WAN vendors are using Yang, as long as the orchestrator is supporting Yang, you have a common descriptor. Yes, you can add a mix to that, but everybody's talking that same language. It's so much easier to automate everything then, and the orchestrator flows down and gives the instructions to everything. So for us, that's been the key to really help simplify automating at that service layer.
Okay, good. More comments, anybody?
Well, I think we have an existence proof for at least the architectural concept. If we look at optical networking, it's very analogous to what we're talking about, which is you're not mixing optical devices under a network manager. What we do is we actually have something on top, and then ultimately even standardize the interface to that actual network manager so we can provide the orchestration that Sue was talking about. It's very similar here. We weren't, and I hope it was clear, we're not talking about vendor A's network CPE and vendor B's CPE under a common controller or third-party controller. That is not likely to happen anytime in the distant future, maybe. But what we are attempting to do, though, is to take those steps toward an environment that we can get to more of a normalized view of the network, and then be able to add a layer of a more abstracted layer on top of this so that we can start to provide these common end-to-end services. And then of course, an integral part of that is to be able to validate at each step of the process, because of the complexity just continues to grow. And at some point, maybe we won't have 50 vendors, as Eric was talking about, but as long as we do, or as long as the end user community is interested in specifying particular SD-WAN CPE, we're going to have to deal with this complexity.
Okay. Anybody else? Or will...
Well, just one comment on that, because what we have done, a number of us have got together and put this proof of concept together to basically validate all these points. So Spirent's in that with Netcracker, with Silver Peak, with Versa, with Adva. So it's what we're really doing is putting all this into reality. So we've created a sort of set of workflows across everyone where you can choose which vendor which SD-WAN vendor, you can choose which software you want, and you can mix and match for a particular enterprise on a CPE. So that's something we'll be showcasing at MEF in Los Angeles. And it's, the work for that is mostly complete right now. So that starts to validate some of the things that we were saying, and all moving towards a common set of sort of standard models or standard APIs that make it easier, because, it is pretty challenging.
Okay, thank you. More questions, or is it still only me? Any other question? Okay, so I'll take this to a bit of a different direction. We spoke about multi-vendor, and we spoke only about the service provider, and we spoke about the end customer. But now I want to talk about the enterprise and the large enterprise. Do you see cases that in a large enterprise we would want to have more than one vendor? Because there is a set of sites that have a certain set of requirements, technically, but mainly cost, and another set of sites that have different requirements because of size or anything else, or location, I don't know. Any thought about that?
Well, the scenario I see in that case is whatever the enterprise's plans are, all bets are off the minute they do an acquisition, and that new acquired entity has a completely different IT infrastructure, SD-WAN approach, and every other problem that they're going to have to be able to integrate. It is just not feasible to think that a large enterprise or a multinational enterprise is going to be able to standardize on a common SD-WAN approach, or at least not the enterprises that we've seen traditionally. Maybe next generation enterprises that are more virtual and that can run in a completely cloud-based infrastructure. Maybe that's possible.
So again, so you're thinking that it will not
enterprises are
happen.
dynamic, just like these services we're talking about. They evolve, and they're going to be bringing on board additional IT infrastructure, no matter what their well-laid plans are.
But I think when we see enterprises, large enterprises deploying on a global scale, I think when they start to look at UCP type of deployments, etc., they probably choose one SD-WAN vendor for the company, but they want to be future-proven, meaning that even though they choose one SD-WAN that fits their needs now, they want to be able to, in the future, shift that implementation to something else or extend the feature set. So I think at least what I see, that's the perspective here, not necessarily start with multiple SD-WAN implementations from day one.
Yeah, it will be gradual.
Yeah.
Yes. I want to comment something, and then we'll continue with the others. One service provider once told me, They have only one SD-WAN vendor. I don't know if still today, but at least in the past they had one. And in different panels, they always used to ask the other service providers. So he told them, okay, so now let's say an enterprise comes and you have two SD-WAN vendors. How do you decide which to give them? Then they answer, okay, we look at the requirements, and based on that, it says, okay, and after 3 months, requirements have changed. What do? Are you switching the vendor? So it's the same case if the enterprise is implementing it by himself. Okay? Any comments?
I would, oh, you want to go?
No.
I think Mark really hit on one of the, just a great scenario or case study of sorts as to what's going to drive, there's always going to be some value in being able to harmonize different vendors, and that acquisition scenario really is a strong one. Not to mention, even before you get to that, if you're talking about a major multinational enterprise, they're going to be operating in all different parts of the world. Not all the SD-WAN vendors are going to be strongest in different parts of the world, and that, then you start to break down the selection criteria on how an enterprise selects an SD-WAN vendor, and they're not all the best at the best things. And not every, use case, not every reason for embarking on an SD-WAN migration is the same, whether just what you're trying to accomplish or what your network is made of, how your enterprise works. So to that end, being able to have sort of a few to choose from, best of breed, would be valuable. But in lieu of that, I suppose they would prefer not to and just make the perfect selection that does everything for me. That would really be the ideal.
Yeah, for that you need something that is very, very flexible. Yeah.
And even if you look at the vendor side, you have the same situation. Cisco goes and acquires somebody, and now they have the nth SD-WAN solution. So I'm a Cisco customer. Oh, I could have a Cisco SD-WAN in the router. I could have Meraki. I could have Viptel. I mean, it just
But
goes
it's
on
like
and on
taking
and on.
from two vendors. It's like taking from two vendors.
Well, it's just
Practically speaking.
that was the point. Is that
Everybody is going like that.
even going to one vendor doesn't solve the complete
Yeah,
problem.
but it's
at
similar
least.
to taking it from two different vendors, from their perspective, because it's
And
they
then
grow differently, and they're different
But then
systems.
when you've done that, then they say, we're going to take our appliance and then virtualize it. Okay, now I have a new vendor because it's a different animal. It's running an NFVI. I mean, we have to plan for a multi-vendor environment. Whether Marcus' point is really key, though. That multi-vendor service is a different animal. But the multi-vendor SD-WAN environment is definitely not something we're going to be able to stay away from.
Okay, so you didn't answer anything. So anything about this? Do you want to say something?
I don't have anything extra. I mean, I did poll
Okay.
some, but they said the same things. They said
Okay.
typically one, but usually we're forced into, either through departments or acquisitions. So it was actually exactly what everyone said, so
Okay.
nothing new.
Yeah, I think, for example, retail is one example that I always look at in the sense because they have many small sites with little bandwidth, not too complicated requirements, very cost sensitive. On the other hand, they have very big head offices, different requirements, and sometimes you just need to bridge it at the HQ and use two different vendors if you don't have enough flexibility. Any questions before we sum up? Come on, we had only one. Marcus, you have another question? No? Okay. So, any comment from somebody here that wants to add something that...
Well, one comment from my perspective is that I'm super happy to talk about multi-vendor, and I think multi-vendor in essence is a UCPE strategy. And I think we see more and more service providers, managed service vendors that go the UCPE route just because they need to prepare for this multi-vendor paradigm shift, or if they are not already there. And I think I see a lot of service providers also already collaborating with multiple vendors, but as you said, they're kind of siloed, and they want to merge these universes together.
Maybe I'll ask one last question. What do you think we as an industry, when I say we, it means the SD-WAN vendors, the service providers, the orchestrators, the standards, everybody. You can pick only one or a few, but what do we need to do in order to make life easier for not only the service provider, also the enterprise that we just said, to really realize such a dream of multi-vendor, and so it won't be such a big headache? Because the example that I gave with that service provider, he told me, if I need to switch now my vendor, that's going to be a nightmare. So how do we avoid this nightmare? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll take it, and if nobody else will, but
Yeah.
I think this is where standardization can at least help, and it's not the panacea. It's not going to solve all these problems overnight, but at least it provides the forum to have the discussion about what should be standardized, the holistic view of standards, meaning it's not just that we're going to have a standard SD-WAN service the way the MEF has identified it, but there's APIs that we could actually standardize that could actually also take steps in the right process. We just have to have the dialogue and then engage with all the stakeholders, which is up and down that value chain from the operators all the way down to any of the vendors who are participating in the SD-WAN, in the community.
I also think that today most of the SD-WAN is closed systems, proprietary systems. And if there could be more openness to the SD-WAN implementations, that will also drive standardization, not necessarily in standardization forums, but de facto standards. Because as far as we see it, we are lower, we are hosting VNFs, hosted SD-WAN VNFs. The standardization that comes along with for instance, Linux and open source and virtualization really helps us to be able to create one solution to host all the different solutions. And I think if that paradigm can be taken further up the stack, that could also help.
So I think on that, I always like to say that on the standardization point of view, we always need to look at the areas that need to be standardized. And we spoke before about the fact that we don't believe that things that run on the wire, meaning between the edge devices, that's not going to be standardized in SD-WAN. It is standardized in other technologies, not in SD-WAN. And we all agree that it probably will not happen. And the other thing are what I call always, so that's interoperability. And the other one is compatibility. Compatibility is those APIs you spoke about. Okay? And those APIs, that's very important. That's what Sue spoke about before. Things on top of that, I think, should be left for the industry. What do you include in your service? What you don't include in your service? That's how we have the variety that you spoke about before. Mm-hmm. These requirements, those requirements, if we will have many, many solutions, different types, a large variety, cost-effective, less cost-effective, but more feature-rich, then it will be an answer for all the industry and not something that is limited to a certain point of view. More comments on this?
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking about it. I mean, it's probably a little bit too clever, but if you think about why SD-WAN came about and what the motivations were for adopting it, maybe look to that, to what needs to be done to make it easier for enterprises. I mean,
so what are those things?
Well, those things are that migrating. Well, the MPLS VPNs were not ideal for cloud connectivity, and nor were they ideal for provisioning time and scalability in terms of bandwidth, and but the problem with going to SD-WAN, now you have to kind of rethink your security regime. So if you could somehow you're going to skip SD-WAN and solve all those problems, and now we don't need SD-WAN anymore. But that's the idea: is to look at what the root issues are that SD-WAN is solving for enterprises, and maybe go to address some of those, and that points the way toward what needs to be done.
Okay, so you're getting the last comment here. Okay.
So I'd say one of the key things is open models, because that, I'd say, is one of the things that we can fix very quickly with things like Yang modeling. It's with the VNFs, it's the Tosca modeling, because the onboarding of these things is tough. It's everybody does it differently, and it puts a lot of emphasis either on the service provider or on the orchestrator to do all that. So I think open models is really key. Then the APIs, of course, to stop needing all the proprietary, and then more of a standard definition area, because if an enterprise doesn't want to particularly choose this vendor or that vendor, you want to standardize on terms so that when you go to the mid-market, they kind of know what they're getting, and it's not different across the entire industry. They know that these set of key features means they'll get these set of key features. So some kind of definition there, so that when you get to the mid-market, it's a little bit easier to order than perhaps we make it today, which is a bit very technical focused.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll meet again at 3:30. Thank you.